The village of Stonebrook sat quietly at the edge of the borderlands where the last stretches of human farmland gave way to the denser woods that still carried the memory of older conflicts. At 30 years old, I had come to know every rut in the dirt paths and every creak in the floorboards of the small wooden house my father had left behind. It was a simple life, tending my modest fields, working in the woodworking shop behind the house, exchanging nods with neighbors who had known me since I was a boy, predictable, comfortable, even, until the woman on the neighboring plot decided the fences between us were more like suggestions than rules. Her father had been an orc warrior who once served along the border during the long years of uneasy peace. After he died, she took over the entire Grey Tusk farm by herself. The villagers spoke of her often, though never with outright malice. She was tall, broad-shouldered in the way orcs tended to be, with skin the deep green of forest shadows and small tusks that caught the light when she spoke. Her hair was dark and thick, usually braided back in a practical knot that still managed to look fierce. She carried herself like someone who had spent her life proving she belonged on that land, and she had an opinion about everything: crops, weather, the placement of boundary stones, even the way the wind blew on a given afternoon. One morning I stepped outside to find 3 of her goats grazing happily in my pasture, their bells clinking as they tore through the grass I had been saving for my own animals. I herded them back across the low stone wall that marked the edge of our properties and stood waiting on my side. She appeared a moment later on the other side of the wall, hands planted firmly on her hips, watching me with those sharp, dark eyes. "I think your goats have forgotten where the boundary lies," I said, keeping my voice even. She looked at the animals, then at the wall, then back at me. "I think your wall is in the wrong place. It has stood exactly where it stands since my father's time." "Then your father placed it wrong." We stared at each other across the stones. For a long moment neither of us moved. Then the corner of her mouth twitched and she let out a short, surprised laugh. I felt the sound pull at something in my chest and, against my better judgment, laughed with her. The goats bleated between us as if they found the whole exchange ridiculous. That was how it began. After the goats came the matter of the irrigation ditch. She claimed I had diverted water that belonged to her fields. I pointed out that the ditch had been dug generations ago and followed the natural slope of the land. She argued that generations ago the land had belonged to different hands and that fairness mattered more than old maps. We stood in the mud for nearly an hour, voices rising and falling with the wind, until a sudden rain sent us both scrambling for cover. She reached her porch first and turned back, rainwater running down her face, and called out that I was stubborn as old oak. I shouted back that she was worse than the goats. We were both grinning when we shut our doors. Then there was the day my horse broke through the fence on the far side and helped himself to half her cabbage patch. I found him there, content and green around the mouth, while she stood with a basket of ruined vegetables and a look that could have stripped bark from trees. She called my name for the first time that afternoon. "Rowan," she said, the single syllable carrying equal parts exasperation and something warmer I could not yet name. "If that beast of yours eats one more leaf from my garden, I will personally teach him the meaning of boundaries." I should have been irritated. Instead, I felt something loosen in my shoulders as I led the horse back through the gap. We argued for 20 minutes about whose responsibility it was to repair the fence, hers for not reinforcing it, mine for not keeping better watch, until the horse wandered off again and we both had to chase him down together. By the time we had him secured, we were covered in dirt and laughing like children who had forgotten they were supposed to be adults. These small collisions became the rhythm of my days. Some mornings I woke and found myself glancing first toward her wooden house before I even stepped outside. At night, when the soft glow of her lantern appeared in the window across the wall, I felt an odd sense of relief I could not explain. The arguments themselves were rarely serious. They were excuses to stand close, to match wits, to watch the way her eyes narrowed when she was winning and the way her laughter broke through when she decided the fight had gone on long enough. I told myself it was simply the way of neighbors in a small village. Every one needed someone to disagree with now and then. It kept the blood moving. Yet I began to notice that the days without one of our little disputes felt strangely flat. I would finish my work in the shop and find my eyes drifting toward her fields, wondering what new complaint she might bring me tomorrow. She never apologized for the goats or the water or the cabbages. Neither did I. We simply met at the wall or in the lane between our homes, traded sharp words that always ended in reluctant smiles, and went back to our separate lives until the next excuse appeared. I did not examine the feeling too closely. There was no need. It was only the ordinary friction of two people living side by side in a place where fences were never quite high enough to keep the world out. Still, each morning I found myself looking first toward her house. Each evening I waited, without admitting it even to myself, for the moment her lantern would flicker to life and tell me she was safe inside her walls. The headaches she gave me had become the most reliable part of my day, and I was beginning to suspect I would miss them if they ever stopped. The days after the cabbage incident settled into something that almost felt like routine. Except the routine now included her. I told myself it was nothing more than neighborly friction, the kind that kept a man sharp in a quiet village. Yet when I walked into the Crooked Mug Tavern 3 evenings later and found Garrick already claiming our usual corner table, the first thing he asked was not about the new batch of ale or the weather. "So," he said, sliding a mug toward me, "when are you planning to marry Thalia?" I nearly choked on the first sip. The ale went down the wrong way, and I had to cough into my sleeve while Garrick grinned like he had just won a bet with himself. "You have lost your mind," I managed once I could breathe again. He shrugged, broad shoulders lifting under his worn leather vest. The man had been my closest friend since we were boys stealing apples from old Master Harlan's orchard. He knew every scar on my hands and every stubborn bone in my body, which apparently made him feel entitled to speak whatever crossed his mind. "Whole village knows," he said simply. "Knows what?" "That you like her." "I do not like her." Garrick counted on his fingers. "You fixed her roof when the storm tore half the thatch off last winter. You helped her pull that wagon out of the mud when the axle broke. You carried medicine from the healer when she had the fever 2 months back and could barely stand. Shall I keep going?" "Those were neighborly things," I muttered. "Anyone would have done the same." "Anyone did not," he replied. "I did not see half the village lining up at her door with hammers and poultices. Just you. For 2 years now." I stared into my mug. The ale had gone flat. 2 years. Had it really been that long since she first took over the Grey Tusk farm? The thought sat heavier than I expected. Garrick leaned back, satisfied he had landed his point. "Deny it all you want. The rest of us have eyes." I changed the subject after that, or tried to. We talked about the harvest and the new blacksmith's apprentice who kept dropping tools on his own feet, but Garrick's words kept circling back in my head like a loose wheel on a cart. Had I really done all those things? I remembered the roof. Yes, because the rain had been coming in sheets and I could hear it from my own house. The wagon, obvious. No one should be stuck in that kind of mud alone. The fever, well, she had looked pale the day before, and I happened to be passing the healers anyway. They were small things, practical things, nothing worth gossip over. Yet, the next morning when I stepped outside and saw her already working in her garden, I felt a strange pull again. She straightened when she noticed me, one hand shading her eyes, and lifted her chin in that way she had when she was preparing for battle or banter. "Your horse left tracks in my barley again," she called across the low wall. I crossed my arms. "Your barley is growing on my side of the stones this year." She considered that, then smiled, small, sharp, and entirely too pleased with herself. "Then perhaps the stones moved. You should check them." I checked them. They had not moved. We both knew it. Still, I spent the better part of an hour walking the boundary with her, arguing about soil and sunlight and whose great-grandfather had planted the first row of markers. By the time we finished, the sun was higher, and she had somehow talked me into helping her prop up a sagging fence post near her chicken coop. She brought honey cakes the following afternoon. They were still warm from the oven, wrapped in a cloth that smelled faintly of herbs. She set them on the workbench inside my shop without asking and leaned against the doorframe while I finished shaping a new handle for one of her hoes. "You did not have to do that," I said, nodding at the cakes. "I know." She watched me work for a while, the quiet between us surprisingly comfortable. "You always fix things when I ask, even when you complain the whole time." "I complain because you ask at inconvenient hours." "You complain because you like the sound of your own voice," she countered, but there was no bite in it. She took one of the cakes and broke it in half, offering me the larger piece without comment. We ate in silence for a few minutes. Outside, the village carried on its usual afternoon rhythm, children chasing each other between houses, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Inside the shop, the air smelled of fresh-cut wood and warm honey. "Why do you never look for an orc to court?" I asked before I could stop myself. The question had been sitting in the back of my mind since Garrick's lecture, and it slipped out now like a loose nail. Thalia paused with the cake halfway to her mouth. She studied me for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. "They bore me," she said at last. "All of them." "Most." She finished the bite and brushed crumbs from her hands. "They talk about battles and glory and the old ways, as if the world stopped changing the day the truce was signed. I have heard the same stories since I was small. I want something different." I turned the new hoe handle over in my hands, checking the grain. "There are a few decent ones in the next village over. Strong, steady. None like the one I want." The words landed softly but left a strange echo in the workshop. I looked up. She was watching me with that same steady gaze she used when we argued about fences or goats or water rights, direct, unflinching, and carrying more weight than the conversation seemed to require. For a heartbeat, I almost understood what she meant. Then the moment passed, and she reached for another cake as if nothing had been said at all. I told myself later that she had been speaking generally. There was no reason to read more into it. She had her life on the farm, and I had mine in the shop, and between them we had these small collisions that made the days interesting. That was all. Still, when I lay awake that night listening to the wind move through the trees, I found myself counting the things Garrick had listed. The roof, the wagon, the medicine, the fence posts, the countless arguments that always ended with both of us laughing. 2 years of them, and now the honey cakes sitting on my table like they belonged there. I rolled onto my side and stared at the dark shape of the wall that separated our lands. Somewhere beyond it, she was probably already asleep, or maybe still awake thinking about tomorrow's work. I wondered, not for the first time, what she thought about when the village grew quiet. The question stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I told myself it did not matter. She was the orc girl next door who argued about everything and laughed when she won. Nothing more. Nothing that required me to examine the way my chest felt lighter on the mornings I knew I would see her. Yet when sleep finally came, the last thought before it took me was the way she had said, "None like the one I want," and how for one brief second it had sounded as if she already knew exactly who that was. The autumn festival arrived on a crisp afternoon when the leaves had turned the color of old copper, and the air carried the first bite of coming winter. Stonebrook emptied itself into the central square. Long tables laden with bread and cheese, musicians playing reels on fiddles and drums, the heavy scent of roasting meat drifting from open pits. Children ran between the stalls while the older folk gathered to watch the wrestling matches, and the younger ones eyed the open space cleared for dancing. I had not planned to stay long. Festivals were loud and crowded, and usually left me with a headache by dusk. Yet when I saw Thalia already there, standing near the edge of the stage with her arms crossed and that familiar half-smile on her face, I found myself drifting closer, instead of heading home. She was arguing with no one in particular about the quality of the roasted pork versus the venison when I reached her side. The moment she noticed me, she tilted her head, eyes bright with challenge. "Tell me the truth," she said without greeting. "Martha's pork or old Hagen's venison? Which actually tastes better?" I considered the question seriously, mostly because I knew it would annoy her if I took too long. "Martha's. The venison is always too dry." "You have no palate," she declared, but she was smiling as she said it. We stood there trading insults about seasoning and smoke and the proper way to baste meat while the music swelled and the first dancers took the floor. It felt easy, the way our arguments always did now, sharp edges softened by the fact that neither of us truly wanted to win. Then the music shifted into something slower, and a figure moved through the crowd toward us. He was young, tall even for an orc, broad through the shoulders with the kind of easy strength that came from years of training rather than farm work. His tusks were polished and his leather armor had been cleaned for the occasion. I recognized him vaguely as one of the warriors who sometimes passed through the village on border patrols. He stopped in front of Thalia, bowed his head with formal politeness, and extended one large hand. "Lady Thalia," he said, voice carrying the clipped accent of the northern clans, "would you honor me with a dance?" The square seemed to grow quieter around us, or perhaps it was only my own hearing narrowing to the space between the three of us. I felt something unpleasant, an entirely irrational twist low in my chest. Jealousy, I realized a second too late. Sharp and unwelcome and completely unearned. I had no claim on her. We were neighbors who argued and occasionally shared honey cakes. That was all. Yet, when I opened my mouth, what came out was not the polite nothing I had intended. "At this rate you will never find a husband," I said, aiming for the light, teasing tone we usually used. The words were meant as a joke, the same kind of careless banter we had traded for months. I even smiled as I said them. Thalia turned her head slowly. The laughter that usually followed our exchanges did not appear. Instead, she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Soft, steady, and far too serious for the noise of the festival. The young warrior waited, hands still extended, but she did not look at him. She took one small step closer to me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of wood smoke and herbs that always clung to her clothes. Her voice dropped low, meant only for me. Only when you ask me. The world stopped. The music faded into nothing. The crowd, the laughter, the smell of roasting meat, all of it vanished as if someone had drawn a curtain between me and the rest of the festival. There was only the warmth of her breath against my ear, the weight of those 6 words settling somewhere behind my ribs, and the sudden violent realization that my heart had forgotten how to beat. I stood frozen, staring at her profile as she turned back to the warrior with perfect calm and shook her head once. "Thank you," she said to him, polite and distant. "But I am not dancing tonight." He bowed again and withdrew without argument. Thalia remained beside me, watching the dancers as if nothing at all had happened. I could not move. My hands felt numb at my sides. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed, and the fiddles struck up a new tune, but the sound reached me as though through deep water. She had not been joking. The knowledge struck me with the force of a physical blow. Every argument, every shared chore, every time she had brought food to my shop or lingered at the wall to trade insults, none of it had been ordinary. She had been waiting, and I, blind and stubborn and impossibly slow, had been too busy convincing myself that the headaches she caused were merely the price of having an opinionated neighbor. Thalia glanced at me once more, a small private smile touching her mouth, then walked away toward the tables where the older women were cutting bread. I remained where I was, rooted to the packed earth of the square, while the festival continued around me like a river flowing past a stone. That night I lay on my back in the dark and stared at the ceiling beams until the first gray light of dawn crept through the shutters. Sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice again, low and certain against my ear. "Only when you ask me." The words rearranged themselves in my mind until they became something larger, something I could no longer pretend not to understand. I loved her. The realization was not sudden so much as it was inevitable, like water, finally finding the lowest point in the land. I had loved her for longer than I could name, perhaps since the morning her goats first crossed the wall and she laughed instead of scolded. Every day since then I had woken looking first toward her house. Every evening I had waited for her lantern. The bickering, the small kindnesses, the way she made the ordinary feel sharp and alive. All of it had been love wearing the disguise of neighborly friction. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes and let out a shaky breath that might have been a laugh or a groan. 2 years of denial. 2 years of pretending the warmth in my chest was irritation. Garrick had seen it. The entire village had seen it. Only I, the man who lived next door and argued with her about fences and water and cabbages, had been too stubborn to look at what was right in front of me. Outside, the wind moved through the trees that lined the boundary between our lands. Somewhere beyond that low stone wall she was sleeping, or perhaps lying awake as I was, waiting to see what I would do with the truth she had placed in my hands. For the first time in my life I understood that the headaches she gave me were not problems to be solved. They were the shape of the life I wanted. And the only question left was whether I had the courage to stop pretending otherwise. The morning after the festival, I woke before the sun had fully cleared the trees. My eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I did not waste time with flowers or pretty words. Thalia had never cared for things that wilted or faded. Instead, I gathered the spare fence posts I had cut weeks ago from my own southern boundary and carried them, along with my hammer and a pouch of nails, across the low stone wall that separated our lands. She was already outside, feeding the horses in the small paddock behind her house. The morning light caught on the dark braid that hung over one shoulder and on the faint green of her skin where it showed above the collar of her work shirt. When she heard my boots on the path, she looked up, and for a moment something uncertain flickered across her face before the familiar wry expression returned. "Fence posts?" she asked, nodding at the load in my arms. I set them down near the section of her southern fence that had been sagging for months. "Yes." Suddenly feeling generous? "I have something to say." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded once and went back to measuring out grain for the horses. I began pulling the old rotting posts from the ground. The work was steady and familiar, digging, setting the new post true, packing earth around the base until it held firm. Thalia finished with the horses and came to sit on a weathered stump a few paces away, watching without comment while I worked. The only sounds were the hammer striking wood and the occasional snort from one of the animals. When the last post was set and the wire restrung between them, I wiped my hands on my trousers and joined her on the broad stump. She had brought out 2 tin cups of hot tea from the house. The steam rose between us, carrying the scent of dried mint and honey. For a while we drank in silence. The sun climbed higher. A light wind moved through the barley she had planted in neat rows. I set my cup down on the ground between my boots. "I think I have been slow," I said. Thalia's mouth twitched. She tried and failed to hide the smile. "Only a little?" "I think you have been trying to tell me something for a long time." "Quite a long time. I have been a fool. Very much a fool." The words came out lighter than I expected. We both laughed, the sound small and private in the morning quiet. When the laughter faded, I turned on the stump so I could look at her directly. She met my eyes without flinching, the same steady gaze she had always used when we argued about boundaries or goats or water. Only now, there was no argument left between us. "Thalia," I said. She made a small questioning sound. "I want to court you properly. If you will let me." Color rose under her green skin. Slow at first, then unmistakable. I had never seen her blush before. In all the months of sharp words and reluctant laughter, she had never once looked uncertain or shy. The sight of it now, the faint darkening across her cheekbones and the way her tusks caught the light when she pressed her lips together, hit me harder than any argument ever had. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed almost fragile. "You finally noticed," she said, voice quieter than usual. I reached for her hand before I could second-guess the impulse. Her fingers were calloused from farm work, strong and warm. She did not pull away. "Is it too late?" I asked. She shook her head. The blush had not faded, but her eyes were bright. "No. Why not?" Thalia smiled then, small and private and entirely for me. "Because I was still waiting." We sat like that for a long time, hands loosely linked, the empty teacups cooling between us. The horses moved lazily in the paddock. Somewhere in the distance a rooster crowed, and the village began its ordinary morning noises. Doors opening, voices calling, the creak of cartwheels on the lane. None of it felt ordinary to me anymore. I had expected relief when I finally spoke the words. What I felt instead was something larger and quieter, like a door opening onto a room I had not known existed inside my own house. 2 years of pretending the warmth in my chest was irritation. 2 years of waking up and looking first toward her fields. All of it had been leading here, to this stump and these cooling cups of tea and the simple, terrifying fact that she had been waiting for me to catch up. Thalia squeezed my fingers once, then let go so she could stand. She brushed dust from her trousers and glanced at the new section of fence I had repaired. "It looks straight," she said. "It should hold." She looked back at me, and the smile she gave me was the same one she had worn the very first morning her goats crossed the wall. Sharp, amused, and carrying far more meaning than the words that followed. "Try not to take another 2 years to ask the next question, Rowan." I stood as well, suddenly lighter than I had felt in months. "I will do my best." We walked together toward the house so she could put the cups away. The distance between our properties had never felt smaller. For the first time, I did not think of the low stone wall as a boundary at all. It was simply the place where our days met, and where, after far too long, I had finally decided to stay. The months that followed the morning on the stump were the happiest I had ever known, though they did not look very different from the ones that came before. Thalia and I began to court in the same way we had done almost everything else, by continuing to argue. We still disagreed about fence lines and water rights and whether her goats were clever or simply stubborn. The only real change was that now, when the arguments ended, I could reach for her hand across the low stone wall. I could pull her close in the evenings when the work was done and feel the solid warmth of her against my chest. I could kiss her and taste the faint sweetness of the honey cakes she still brought to my shop, and know without doubt that she was mine and I was hers. We walked the hills together when the first hard frost came. One clear afternoon in early winter, we climbed to the ridge that overlooked the valley and sat on a flat rock, while the last light turned the fields below to gold. The air was sharp enough to sting our cheeks, but we had brought thick wool blankets and a flask of hot tea. For a long time, we simply watched the village lights begin to appear one by one in the gathering dusk. I turned to her. "When did you start liking me?" Thalia was quiet for so long I thought she might not answer. Then she smiled, small and private, the same smile she had worn the morning her goats first crossed into my pasture. "From the goats," she said. I stared at her. "That long?" "Almost 3 years." I dropped my head into my hands and groaned. 3 years, and you never said anything?" "I did say something," she replied, laughing now. "Many times. You were simply too slow to hear it." I thought back over every honey cake left on my workbench, every visit to the shop under the pretense of needing a handle fixed or a coop built. Every evening she had lingered at the wall just to trade words with me. She had been speaking the entire time. I had simply been too busy pretending the warmth in my chest was irritation instead of something far more dangerous and far more necessary. Spring arrived slowly that year, the snow melting in patches and the first green shoots pushing through the cold earth. On a bright morning, when the air still carried the last bite of winter, I led Thalia to the exact section of fence I had repaired the day after the festival. The new posts stood straight and true between us. She looked at them, then at me, and raised one eyebrow in the way she always did when she suspected I was about to do something foolish. I had no flowers. I had no ring. I had only the truth I had carried with me since the night she whispered those 6 words against my ear. "I am not good with pretty speeches," I told her. "You already know that." She nodded, waiting. "I only know that I want to argue with you for the rest of my life, about fences and goats and water and every other small thing that gives us an excuse to stand close. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are on the other side of this wall. I want to grow old listening to you tell me I placed the boundary stones wrong even when we both know they have not moved in 30 years. Thalia laughed, the same bright, surprised laugh she had given me the very first time we stood across from each other with 3 goats between us. It was the sound that had started everything. "Yes," she said. I blinked. "That quickly?" "I have been waiting 3 years, Rowan. Do not make me wait any longer." She stepped forward and kissed me there beside the fence we had fought over so many times. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright and her cheeks were flushed, and for once she did not try to hide either. We were married in the village square on a warm day in early summer with half of Stonebrook watching and the other half pretending they had not been placing bets on when it would finally happen. Garrick stood beside me and looked far too pleased with himself. Thalia's hand in mine felt like the most natural thing in the world. Many years later, when our hair had gone silver and the fence posts we had set together had begun to weather again, we still sat on the porch of the house that had once been only mine and was now ours. The village had grown a little, but the low stone wall between our old properties remained exactly where it had always been. We still argued about small things. We still teased each other until one of us laughed first. The arguments no longer ended at the wall. They ended with her head resting against my shoulder and my arm around her waist, the way it was on this particular evening. As the sun slipped behind the hills, I looked down at her and smiled. "At this rate, you will never find a husband." Thalia did not lift her head. She simply pressed closer, her voice soft with the same certainty she had carried since the night of the festival. "That is true," she said. "I only ever planned to marry one." Her hand found mine on the arm of the chair and squeezed once, the way it had on the morning I finally stopped being slow. "And it is fortunate for you," she added, "that you eventually asked."